Hello and welcome to the lecture today, where we're going to look at power, violence, and politics. Violence and conflict is an area of research that often isn't delved into by social scientists. Part of the reason is that it is obviously a very sensitive topic, and also a lot of people kind of have a mistaken belief that by looking into violent acts, questioning them, or trying to understand the motivations of individuals in terms of their usage of violence, that by looking at these things they will in fact be condoning the acts of violence. That is most certainly not the case, but it can of course restrict people from, or at least kind of impede them from wanting to pursue it. Another thing that makes violence and conflict very difficult to look at is that it can be cross-culturally challenging. Now, in terms of anthropology, it is essential that we are able to explore violence and conflicts in a cross-cultural sort of way. So we need to be able to look at something that's happening within our own culture and then compare it to another culture to see what similarities there are and also what things are different about each kind of performance of violence. Now, as many of you are aware, what we would consider to be violence here may not be considered to be violence in another country. And of course, we can think of that in terms of the occurrence of other events in different countries or different cultures that are thought of as being kind of with quotes around it normal or an important part of their cultural history and tradition. So we have things like cockfighting occurring, bullfights occur, and to many people in North America, these are seen to be kind of savage and barbaric acts, and we think of these things as being completely inappropriate. Now, of course, often these are the same people who would look at a fight during a hockey game and cheer it and think that that is completely normal, and never really kind of challenge themselves to say, what is going on here? You know, am I being ethnocentric when I'm making these determinations as to what is violent and what isn't violence at all? So when we go through this section, there are going to be numerous instances, I imagine, where you yourselves are going to be challenged. You're going to have to pause and really reflect upon these things. It's important to stress that, again, just by looking at things and trying to understand them through the eyes of another individual, that by no means that you are condoning these acts of violence. All you are trying to do is to get kind of the holistic image or the holistic picture, which is very important for anthropological research. We want to delve into the depths of what is going on and to give all the participants in these performances equal voices whenever possible. So in this section, what we're going to look at is, again, violence and conflict, looking at power and how it is used and how it comes to play in the performance of violence itself, and also the kind of the politics that exist within this domain of violence and conflict. So violence should be thought of as a synchronic event, as though it is a type of a social relationship that exists between individuals and collectivities that serves specific ends at the intergroup level as well as the intragroup level. So violence serves a purpose, and it serves to achieve specific ends at the intergroup level. So for people who are a member of a group, and also the intergroup level, so between groups themselves. And violence, we know, can cause a group of individuals to come together. We form tighter bonds, we cooperate more for fear of violence from someone who is outside of the group. Violence can also tear a group apart. Violence can cause us to align ourselves with another group of individuals for fear that this other group is going to come and get us, and that if we come together with this other group, we are going to be able to protect ourselves better, protect our resources better. And violence, or the thought or the perception that there may be violence, can cause us to go after another group. So violence is constantly working in terms of group dynamic and collective dynamics. So when we're looking at violence and conflict, we have to be aware at what levels it is operating act. So violent confrontation should be understood as social actions that are in fact relative to the interests and convictions of the conscious actors. Now, violence, when we initially kind of think about it, seems to be something that is completely antisocial, that it is the very thing that will tear a group apart and that it serves no social function. But nothing can be further from the truth. Violence actually reveals to us that a social relationship does in fact exist. Because if that social relationship did not exist, there would be no need to resort to violence in the first place. Because neither group would be understanding the motivations or the meaning behind that violent action. So violence has everything to do with cultural factors. Conflicts are understood and mediated by society's cultural perceptions that in fact give specific meaning to the situation. It allows us to evaluate this violent conflict on the basis of experiences that we've had of past conflicts. When we are encountered with violent conflict, what we do is we use our cultural perceptions to understand what it is that is going on. And we will, meaning as a group, look to our objective knowledge that we have stored as part of our group's social memory. And this is what causes, for example, two cultural groups, a Canadian and an American, are both witnessing a violent act happen. Now, the Canadian can be interpreting it in a very different way and also formulating how they are going to react to that violent encounter or that violent act in a very different way than the American can be or could be. Now, it has nothing to do with biology. It has nothing to do with genetics. It has everything to do with our cultural and our historical differences. We are coming at these acts, these violent acts, with very different stored social memories that in a way have kind of groomed us or caused us to see things through a very specific cultural lens. And so conflicts need to be understood again in terms of their own cultural factors. Violence has a performative quality to it. Violence without an audience will still leave people dead, but it is socially meaningless. Violent acts are efficient because of their staging power. They have legitimacy because of the physical results of these acts that take place. So violence is efficient because it has such staging power. It can send a message to a large audience in a way that no other performance or no other act can. So violence as a performance can get its message across clearly to a large majority of people, most of whom are never actually physically affected by it. And a perfect example of this is if we think about 9/11 and what happened not only on that day, but what has happened since then. So for most individuals taking this course, if I was to ask you, do you remember specifically and clearly what took place on 9/11 during the attacks? Do you remember what our culture, in terms of the Canadian culture, was like before 9/11 and what it has been like after or since 9/11? Most of you are too young to have clear memories of what went on that day. And even if you kind of remember what happened that day in terms of the Twin Towers coming down and, the planes being grounded, little, snippets of what happened, it's very difficult for you to be able to think about the way our lives were in terms of a culture before that event occurred. Now, of course, since then, your lives have dramatically changed, or your cultural lives have dramatically changed. And I don't know if there is anyone taking this class who was physically affected by this attack, whether or not you knew someone who was in the Twin Towers or knew someone who was hurt because of this. But again, the odds are pretty slim. But yet, even though we will say most of us taking this course and listening to this lecture were never physically affected by it, our lives have changed. Our culture has changed. And this should demonstrate to you guys how efficient a violent act can be. It gets its message across, right? It can do it to a large majority of individuals. It can do it to the whole world. A message can be sent to the whole world because of this violent performance. So violence is a basic form of social action that occurs under concrete conditions, targets concrete victims, and creates concrete settings. It also obviously produces very concrete results. Violence is a resource in social relationships. Again, without that social relationship, there is no reason to resort to violence. Violence is in fact evidence that a social relationship does exist. Acts of violence are not sudden outbursts of aggression devoid of history or meaning. This may be difficult to believe, but there is no such thing as a senseless, random act of violence. Now, you as a victim of an act of violence that appears to be random would think this doesn't make sense, right? I was walking down the street and someone threw a rock at me. There was no meaning for this. There was no history to this. This is truly a random, senseless act of violence. But when you backtrack and you think about this, you should understand that you were targeted. Whether you were targeted because of the clothing, your gender, your ethnic identity, the neighborhood that you were in, the perceived class level that you have, whatever it is, there was a reason why you were selected. And the person who is performing this act of violence is doing so because they want to send this message. Whether it is that they're rebelling against another school, another team, people who they perceive as impeding their ability to have success in society. You know, whatever their meaning is or whatever their motivation is, they want to send this message. They want people to understand what it is that they're trying to articulate, and that they have gone to violence as a performance in order to do this. Violence is performed as well as it is imagined by socially positioned human beings under specific historical conditions and for very, very concrete reasons. Violence can best be understood by viewing it as a cultural category. Again, it is a major cultural category. It's used to generate stored objective social memory for cultural groups. So it is, again, or should be understood by viewing it as a cultural category. It is historically developed and it is culturally formed as well. How people conceive of violence and the meaning it has for them depends on the time that the violence occurred, the place that the violence occurred, and can vary with historical circumstances. It also depends on the perspective of those individuals who are involved in this, and we will look at this when we come to other sections here. But if we're talking about the perspective of individuals involved, was this a good or a positive violent conflict encounter or performance? Well, are you the offender? Are you the victim? Are you the witness of this violent act? Are you on the winning side or are you on the losing side? All of these things are most definitely going to change your perception and obviously your interpretation of this violent act. So is violence a natural human state, or does culture influence our actions and our understanding and or justification of these violent actions? Hopefully now you should come to the conclusion that yes, culture does majorly influence our actions and our understandings and our justifications of violent actions. This is a big question that always gets asked. Is violence a natural tendency for human beings? Meaning, are we genetically predetermined to find ourselves in this naturally aggressive state? And do we need to have regulation? Do we need to have a political authority, a military, a monarchy, whatever it is, to control us? Because left to our own human devices, we would just be running, all around and just causing chaos and hurting one another. No. Right? Do we have within us natural kind of reactions to certain stimuli? Completely we do, obviously. There's fight and flight, right? And so these things are hardwired into us. But that isn't the end all and the be all of violence or violent reaction. Violence is so much more than that. And violence, again, has everything to do with culture. So why is it that we tend to default to there being a natural understanding for our perceptions of aggression and or violence? Well, many early thinkers caused us to have this understanding. One of the more influential early thinkers, of course, is Thomas Hobbes. And the Leviathan in 1651, Hobbes is talking about humans in their state of nature or their natural state, where they would be in a constant state of war. It would be man against man, and life would be nasty, brutish, and short. And Hobbes thought this was the original state, the state which all kind of civilized societies had begun in, and that they had eventually moved themselves out of. And so he's talking about this state of nature, and he says this is just an absolutely horrific way for any individual to live. There's no understanding of personal property, right for life. None of these things exist because I'm just self-motivated. I am wanting to survive, and I will do anything I need to survive at all. And if that means killing you, then I will in fact kill you. He said at a certain point, human groups began to realize that there must be a better way to live. And so what the human groups did is they came together and they entered into what's referred to as being the social contract. So the social contract, quite simply, is that we come together and we say, I'm going to give up a certain degree of my rights and liberties to a central political authority who will then use their power to protect my interests. So I know that I'm giving up a certain degree of my freedoms to this central political authority, but I'm doing so because I know that they are going to be better able to protect me. And so then I can have property, I can have this right to life, I can have all these kind of benefits that Hobbes believed kind of came part and parcel with having this centralized political authority. For Hobbes, he believed every human being had a natural inclination, again, to be violent, and that this violence needed to be reined in, and the only way it could be controlled is if there was authority in place to control it. When we get to the question of whether or not there are peaceful societies that exist, I want you guys to think back to what Hobbes is saying, because what you will find is that Hobbes was completely wrong in his type of thinking, but his thinking has been used as a way to justify very strong political control over groups of individuals, and obviously to justify colonial expansion into regions that were seen to not have a central political authority. So they did so with the belief that they were taking these individuals out of this kind of savage, brutal, natural state of nature and making them more civilized, making their lives better. So again, when we come to the question of whether or not there are peaceful societies, I want you to think back to this type of thinking, and you will see how unfortunately wrong Thomas Hobbes was with this. Now, because we're doing violence and conflict, we need to have a definition of violence. Very difficult to pinpoint a working definition of violence, especially one that can stand up to cross-cultural examination. This is the one that I choose to go with because it's the most workable one, and it allows for cross-cultural differences and also allows for recognition that violence is very, very dynamic, and it's all about perspective. So David Ritchie's in 1986 declares that violence is an act of physical, and I added mental or emotional, which I'm sure David Ritchie's would have no issue with. But violence is an act of physical, mental, or emotional hurt that is deemed to be legitimate by the performer of that act of violence and by some of the witnesses. Remember, violence is about cultural factors, and violence is an expression of a social relationship. It doesn't mean that everyone who is being impacted by that violent action needs to understand it, and they most certainly do not all need to deem it to be legitimate. All that is important is that the performer of that act of violence and some of the witnesses deem it to be legitimate. And that is why, of course, they were motivated to turn to violent performance in order to meet the ends or meet or to express kind of the meaning that they wanted to through that action. So violence needs to be understood as a total social fact and a social action. Violence is never completely idiosyncratic. It is never the feature of just one person. Again, it always talks or always speaks to there being a relationship, whether it's between a group of individuals and another group of individuals, a person who's an individual of one ethnic group and a person who's an individual of another ethnic group. There's always some social relationship that is being expressed through the act itself. Violence is never completely senseless or meaningless to the actor of that violent action. Again, they need to believe their act of violence to be legitimate. And not only do they believe it to be legitimate, but again, they're believing that there are going to be witnesses of this violent act who also say, yes, that was a legitimate, and I suppose you could put quotes around it, but say a correct action to take. Violence is never a totally isolated act. Again, violence always has a history. It has a meaning. It has a tie to a cultural group. There is always these other factors that are influencing this expression of violence. We tend to, again, in our society, believe that violence is something that they do. And they are individuals who are thought of as being criminals, evil people, or just uncivilized individuals. This type of thinking was used for the most part as justification for civilizing colonial projects. It is still used today as rationalization as to why certain violent acts are allowed to continue against groups of individuals. Violence is often thought of as something that is irrational, that emerges from fits of rage or other highly emotional and not altogether controllable situations. We do this to create a category of this irrational other, and this allows us to distance ourselves from them. And that is probably the most dangerous thing that we can do. Because by distancing ourselves from them, what we are saying is that we would never have this capacity to act in a same manner of violence or in a similar manner of violence as this person did. And the reality is that we all have the same capacity to act violently towards another individual. The only thing that needs to happen is that our social factors or our environmental factors need to change. And a lot of us would find us doing things that we would not be able to rationalize in any other condition or any other situation. Whenever people say things like, for example, Hitler was the embodiment of pure evil. And we won't get into a discussion as to whether or not evil exists. We can save that if I ever create an anthropology of evil course. But to say something like that, that Hitler was the embodiment of evil, takes him out of the realm of being human and elevates him to being something other than us. And he doesn't get to have that. He doesn't get to be seen as something other than human. Quite simply, he was human. That was it. He was you, he was me, he was everyone else out there. There were a lot of circumstances and a lot of factors that led to the unfortunate events that occurred. These absolutely horrific actions that he took, targeting groups of individuals. But he was human. Right? To say that he was something other than human, again, gives him more power than he even remotely deserves to have. And it also causes us to distance ourselves from those events. And we need to put ourselves right into the mix, and we need to understand that we all, again, have the same capacity to commit an act of violence. You know, that's going to force us to really address this and really look at where violence comes from and where the meaning for violence comes from. Violence is a basic form of social action that occurs under concrete conditions, targets concrete victims, it creates concrete settings, and produces concrete results. Violence, in terms of looking at violence, this allows us, because of the concrete settings and the concrete results, that means we can look at violence and we can compare violence between cultures in relation to the causes of this violent event, the event itself, and also the eventual end result of these violent actions. So if we think about the causes of violence, violence often results from confrontations over or that stem from competition over social or material resources. A lot of violence comes out of this need for, this want for, this desire for social or material resources. Now, a social resource can mean that you have been denied access to a student scholarship, and you feel as though you've been denied access to the student scholarship because you weren't of a certain ethnic group. Your gender wasn't the correct gender that was being given kind of priority in terms of the giving out of this scholarship. And so you feel, hey, you know, this social resource has been taken away from me. I deserve it. My grades are good. I'm doing everything correct in university. So why is it I'm being denied this? And once you feel as though this social or material resource has been taken away from you, or you've been restricted from gaining access to it, you can look to the individuals who you feel are the cause of this. And so now you have someone to target. Right? And now we get into the event of the violent act itself. So violent acts are highly visible and usually take place in a public arena, which makes it easy to document or reconstruct the processual aspects into events themselves. And so we look at what happened or is happening. We understand kind of the social action, the meaning that's behind this violent performance. What potentially caused these individuals to act in this sort of way. And once we have that information, then what we can do is kind of package up the violent occurrence into an event. And the event obviously includes the result. So the result of violence produces unique experiences that are culturally mediated and stored in a society's collective memory. These representations form an important resource for the perception and also allow us to legitimize future actions of violence or the denial of action of violence towards another group of individuals. So if we look at, again, cultural difference between Canada and the United States, you can see how, again, two individuals, one from Canada, one from the United States, could be confronted with a violent action. And by looking at the cause of that action, putting it in terms of an event, that they may interpret it in a very different sort of way. And the Canadian may say, listen, I'm not viewing this as being a terrorist action. I don't feel as though I need to be on high alert, and that this wasn't an attack on my liberty or my freedoms. Whereas someone from the United States may look at this and say, this is absolutely a terrorist act. And, you know, they're challenging the basic ideas of what it means to be an American, to have freedom, you know, to respect others, whatever it is. And why are they interpreting these things in two very different ways? Well, they have different cultures, and also they have different collective memories. Now, gendered violence is something that I want to touch on. Obviously, you can do a whole course, a whole semester on gendered violence, but I do feel as though it's important that we address it just a little bit in this section, because it does speak to power, who is perceived to have power within any society, and how they go about expressing that. So when we talk about gendered violence, often what is kind of thrown into the arena of the discussion is the influence of hegemonic masculinity. So it's important that we pin down a definition of hegemonic masculinity. So hegemonic masculinity is understood as the pattern of practice. So basically the things that are done, not just the expectations that we have in the society, or just our understanding of identity, but basically it is the pattern of practice, the things that are done again and again and again, that allow males to have dominance over women in a society. Now, hegemonic masculinity and the expression of it can come about in our understandings, for example, of phrases such as, a man can never hit a woman. So by saying a man can never hit a woman, we are saying that because A, we want to prevent violent action occurring from one individual to another, but there's a lot that's embedded into what we are saying that we don't sit down and really reflect upon. So why is it that we say that a man should never hit a woman under any circumstance? And some people will go so far as to say, even if she were to hit him, that a man under no circumstance should retaliate and hit a woman. What is our reasoning for thinking this way and for saying this? A big part of our reasoning is that we think that men are more powerful than women. So what we are saying is that women are weaker, women are more fragile, and because of this, men should not abuse that natural dominance that they have. So what we're stating in that statement is that women should be accepting of kind of this victim role. And we're also making males out to be natural aggressors and naturally kind of dominant. And I don't think that anyone listening to this lecture views it that way. But again, rarely would someone challenge this. Do we have a saying in our society that a woman should never hit a man? That is never put on the table, or very rarely is that even addressed. Why don't we address it? Because we think that even if a woman were to hit a man, the damage that she could do would be minimal. So it's not even worth us thinking about it. What we need to do is we need to prevent this uneven balance of power being used to abuse this submissive or more gentle or more fragile section of our community. And just that saying in and of itself allows us again to kind of continue this hegemonic masculinity that allows for this naturalization that one gender is by nature more powerful or more dominant over another gender. So what I'd like you to do is just pause for a moment, watch lecture video number 1, which is posted on your courses, and then continue on to the next slide. So what we have on this slide is some examples of words that really express hegemonic masculinity in our society, and this is in North America or in Canada. So if I was the coach of a male basketball team and I said to them, you guys are running like girls, I want you to pick it up. Am I saying something that is a compliment to them? Or in that statement, am I saying to them, you are doing something incorrect? You are doing something that isn't strong, isn't being expected of you. I want something more from you. I want you to be powerful. I want you to be dominant. And right now you're being anything but powerful and dominant and successful. You are being a girl. And to be a girl is seen to be something that is negative within this type of thinking, within this type of a structure. Now, this is problematic. When we think about individuals within our society, I was a national level speed skater and road cyclist for around 20 years of my life. And I trained with Katrina LeMay-Doan, Clara Hughes. These were teammates, these were friends. And so for me, if someone was to say, you're running like a girl, I think to them and I think, wow, anyone would be lucky to run like them. But obviously that is not the cultural understanding of what is being said to individuals with this type of speak. To call people a fairy, to call them a sissy. What you're saying to them is you're not being masculine. Right? We need manliness. We need you to be a leader. We need you to stand up. We need you to be strong. Now, why is it that we want males to be strong within our society? The reason is that we have painted this understanding where women or children are viewed to be resources, and resources that are in need of protection. And who is burdened with the role of protecting the women and children? Well, men are. So when we're talking about violence and gender violence, even if we're talking specifically about male violence against women, we're not talking, the whole picture isn't just about men dominating over women. Men also have a burden in this type of thinking because males are expected to be the breadwinners. Males are expected to be protective, hardworking. They are expected to use violence at times, to be aggressive at times. So what we said to males in our society is that women and children are resources, and as resources they need protection. It is your responsibility to protect these resources. And to do so, at times, we are going to expect that you are aggressive and that you are violent. If we have this expectation of men within our culture, then we should not be surprised when at times that violence and aggression is used against the female gender or against children. Because basically we said to them, this is what we expect of you. We've groomed a whole gender to have to act in an aggressive way in order for them to have their identity completely understood as that of being masculine. Now, when talking about violence and how we address gendered violence. Now, there is the Man Up campaign that happens every year. And before we get into this discussion, I just want to say, obviously the individuals who organize this and who participate in this are doing a wonderful thing. They're trying to address violence. They're making it a more kind of public discussion. And they're taking action against a problem that they see within our society. What I am asking you guys to reflect upon is the terminology itself that is used within the campaign. So, in the Man Up Against Violence campaign, let's isolate the phrase man up. So we have a campaign that is saying, listen, men need to take responsibility and not be aggressors. They need to ensure that not only are they not acting violent towards women, but also that they're ensuring that other men aren't acting in a violent or aggressive manner towards women and towards children. And the way that they're going to do this is by manning up. But the phrase itself, man up, means to be aggressive, to be violent. Again, if I'm a coach of a male football team and the guys are running around the field and they're kind of dragging their feet and they're not performing in the way I want them to, and I yell at the team to man up, what I'm saying is I want you to be everything but feminine. I want you to be everything but weak. I want you to suck it up, and I want you to, finish the drills or do whatever it is. So it's really hard for me to understand how manning up, meaning acting in a violent or aggressive or an overly manly sort of way, can create an atmosphere where violence isn't then going to trickle into usage against women and children. If we want to really target gendered violence, then we have to break down these paradigms, these structures that we've set up that say to be male means that you have to be, aggressive, dominant, powerful, the breadwinner, tough, controlling. We need to say that all genders can have equal expression of this, and that your identity as a man is not going to be dependent solely upon what we're seeing here. That a female can also be dominant, aggressive, powerful, successful, and that is fine in terms of who she is in expression of being kind of gendered as female. So there are social and cultural factors that contribute to gendered violence, and gendered violence in particular, where we're seeing male against female violence, male dominance within a society, extreme forms of male bonding within the cultural system itself. And so male bonding occurs often within sports teams. And so in North America and in Canada in particular, we have a lot of sports teams which are male dominant and which are built around this understanding of male on male bonding. And so it's not surprising that we see also high occurrence of male against female violence happening. There is hierarchy of stratification that exists within the culture itself. So we've put people on different levels within the society, and we've denied individuals or made it difficult for some individuals to achieve success or to achieve rising up from one strata to another strata. And so once you restrict this access to social or material resources, again, you have competition that breaks out over it, and with competition often comes violent action. There's a concept of honor that is tied to the protection of family resources. Again, women and children are often viewed of as being these valuable resources. And so we said to males within our society, you are burdened with the responsibility to protect them. So to give you an idea, let's say I'm in my house, there's a noise downstairs, an intruder's breaking in, and my husband grabs a baseball bat, runs downstairs, and chases off this intruder. Has my femininity been called into question through his actions? Not at all. Right? In fact, in many ways, it's bolstered my gendering in terms of being a female. I was the female, I was at risk, there was this male who was there to protect me, so everything worked out according to kind of the social plan or the cultural plan that we have. Now let's flip it to see if it works for the other gender. So I'm in my house, an intruder breaks in or is starting to break in downstairs. I grab the baseball bat, run downstairs, chase the intruder out of the house while my husband cowers in the closet. Has his gender been called into question? Absolutely, right? His masculinity is going to be questioned and is going to be challenged should anyone find out about that. And so you can see again the burden that we've put on both genders, but obviously in this scenario we've put on males to say, listen, we need you to act aggressive, to put your life at risk, to be the strong, confident, powerful one, while we just get to be kind of the, when we meaning the female gender, get to be the weak ones in need of protection. We have culturally specific values that exist within the society. So sports, again, where we have male on male bonding, ideas about nurturing, which place women in a very kind of passive role. We feel as though if someone's going to be a nurturer, that they should not have an aggressive tendency to them. And that's also part of the reason why, if we're going to say females are by nature nurturers, then males need to be in a position to protect them because they are going to be vulnerable. So you can see kind of a framework that's starting to build in terms of where gendered violence is coming from. So are all acts of gendered violence committed as a gesture towards the victim's gender? So if a male hits a female, is it simply that the male is lashing out against all females? So is it his way of saying, you know, males have dominance over females, and there's something about the females that I just don't like, so I'm going to attack them? No. Right, there's more that's going on with these acts than simply just an attack on this other gender. Violent actions can also be committed as a gesture to members of the same gender. So if I want to be male, I can prove that, and by prove I have quotes around that. I can prove that by dominating the females in my life, by dominating the children that are in my life. And if my culture and my society is structured in such a way, it can view this as being kind of natural and the right thing to do, and in many cases the expected thing to do. There was an ethnography that was written a few years ago, and I can't remember the region of Mexico where this anthropologist did their research, but just to give you an idea of what this researcher found out in terms of masculinity, the mothers in this region are incredibly proud of their sons when their sons beat their wives, because that means that they have expressed themselves finally as being true men, as though they are the ones who are dominating and controlling the household and controlling the women and children within this household. So again, you have a mother being incredibly proud of her son when he beats his wife. Now, tied into this though is, should anyone within the family, so let's say her son beats his wife, the mother is incredibly proud of that, but her daughter's husband beats her, that's not acceptable, because the mother doesn't view that as being an appropriate action, that her daughter's husband beat her. So now her son has to protect the daughter's honor by going after the daughter's husband and beating him. So you can see violence on top of violence. And if the mother's husband should beat her, that's also not acceptable. But yet she takes great pride in her son beating his wife. Very, very kind of chaotic sort of thinking until you kind of pause and think about it. And there is an unfortunate kind of logic that exists behind these types of actions and behind the meaning that individuals give them. Now, if we're talking about gendered violence, it's very important that we stop for a moment and acknowledge that gendered violence is never one-sided, and it's most certainly not one-sided in the way that we think in North America or that we think in Canada. When we talk about the statistics of individuals who will experience domestic violence throughout the course of their life, the percentage that comes back is that approximately, and there's different stats, but let's just go with this, approximately 50% of all women will experience domestic violence at some point in their life. So 50% of all the women listening to this lecture will at some point, if they have not already, experience domestic violence. Now that is of course problematic. And we think it's one-sided. We think that men don't have to worry about this. The reality is, and I think many of you will find this a little bit surprising, the reality is that at least 40% of males will also, at some point in their life, experience domestic violence. That percentage is not that far off. We're basically talking about the same amount of individuals experiencing domestic violence at some point in their life. Now, when I talk about 40% of males who may experience domestic violence at some point in their life, I think that figure is very, very low. Why do I think that figure is low? Because I know it is incredibly difficult for males to inform anyone that they are in fact experiencing domestic violence in their home. So as a female, if I go to the police and I say, listen, my husband is beating me, is my gender being challenged in that statement? No. Right, again, in many ways it's bolstering my gender identity. I'm a female and there's a male abusing me. We kind of expect that, and that's unfortunate, but we kind of expect that. And so I'm not being challenged. I'm still a female. Everything is fine. My femininity is not called into question. Now, if my husband were to go to the police and say, listen, my wife is beating me, is his masculinity going to remain unchallenged? Or are people going to question whether or not he truly is the man that he claims to be? And so very difficult for males to step forward and admit to anyone, let alone someone who can help them, that they are experiencing domestic violence in their home at all. My mom worked for the transition house for around 25 years, and during that 25 years I believe there was only 3 times that they were ever approached by males seeking refuge, and they weren't able to offer them a place to stay because there's no structure in place in our society to allow men to escape violent situations or domestic violence situations. Now, given that we have a very close percentage of males who may be or will be experiencing domestic violence in their life, of course this is something that we do need to think about and we do need to reflect upon, because we've made it very prohibitive for them to step forward and them to seek the refuge that they need and to be validated in their experiencing of this violence as well. So with this video that I'm going to ask you to pause and watch, you're going to see a social experiment that is done. So the video at the first part is the male being very aggressive towards the female in a central area, and you'll see the public react to that, and then they go and switch it and the female is very aggressive and violent towards the male. And what you're going to see happen is, I think, very unfortunate, but speaks to what we have been talking about in this section. Whereas we expect the genders to behave in certain ways and that our reaction is dependent upon that, right? Our interpretation of what is unfolding before us comes from these cultural factors and causes us to behave in a certain sort of way and to see things in a very specific manner as well. So please pause and on your courses go to lecture number 2 and give it a watch. Right, so in talking about different cultural understandings of violence and how that can cause individuals to behave or react in different ways to a violent occurrence, we have the quote here saying that nothing seems more obvious than violence and nothing seems more odious. Is this statement true? I don't believe this statement is true. It's very difficult to understand what is in fact violent and what isn't in fact violent, and then also to come to a point where we can know how it is that we should react to it. So you can have this scenario, where a man calls a woman a bitch. Is that an act of violence? How should you react to it? If you're walking down the street and you see a guy yelling at a female, calling her a bitch, acting in an aggressive manner, odds are pretty good that you might step in or at least keep your eye on the situation. If it's flipped around and you see the woman calling this guy a son of a bitch and being very aggressive to him, I would assume that many of you would react in the way that the individuals in the video that you just watched were reacting, where it's kind of amusing. You're not concerned about the safety of the male in this type of a situation. And in fact, you think, oh, he probably got caught doing something, so her behavior is appropriate. Whereas if he at any point puts his hands on her, that is deemed to be inappropriate and culturally not acceptable. What if we have a situation where a soldier shoots another soldier during war? Is that a violent action, and is that a justifiable violent action in terms of culturally? Are we accepting of this if we have entered into this violent engagement? A soldier killing a soldier during war, as long as he's followed the rules of engagement, that seemed to be a clean kill, a good kill. He's given orders to do this action, he did the action, and that is socially accepted or culturally accepted. What if a soldier kills a civilian during wartime? That is problematic, right? You still have a death occurring, and you have the same kind of event or physical end event happening. There's a dead person now, but even though the same bullet could be used, even though it can be the same soldier standing there, and in theory the same person, although in the first scenario they're viewed to be a soldier, second scenario they're viewed to be a civilian, in terms of the civilian situation, that would not be acceptable for someone from Canadian culture to find out that one of our Canadian soldiers had gone and killed a civilian. That would not be an appropriate action to take. It doesn't follow the rules of engagement. Not only that, it doesn't fit in with a Canadian way of thinking. We had the case a few years ago of Captain Semaru, who in Afghanistan his unit had been given the orders to fire on a group of insurgents, and so they fire on the group of insurgents, and then they move forward to assess the damage that was done. Once they have fired on the group and they've moved forward to assess the damage that has been done, they enter into a different kind of, or a different expectation of engagement. So they can, they're expected, if they find wounded individuals on the ground, that they switch into a caregiver mode, and that they're no longer seen to be violent aggressors. So Semaru and his unit move forward. They find an insurgent on the ground. The reports as to his injuries will vary, but basically his injuries were life-threatening, and this guy had a very, very low chance of survival, even if they would have been able to medevac him out right away. So they call for a helicopter to medevac him out. They find out that that is just not available for them at the moment. All their helicopters are in use in other areas, and this insurgent is lying on the ground, is in extreme pain, and there's nothing medically that they can do to help reduce his pain, reduce his suffering, or stabilize him until a medical unit can come in and offer him proper service. So Captain Semaru at this point makes a decision to kill this individual, to put this individual out of their misery. And when he does that, then obviously he steps outside of the realm of the rules of engagement as set by the military, and also steps outside of the scope of what it means to be Canadian and to act in an appropriate manner when representing us as a member of our military. And so he had to face charges on this, eventually was stripped of his rank and kicked out of the military, and had criminal charges that he also had to face. So violence is not as clear cut as we think it is. Very difficult for us to know, is this absolutely violence, or is there more going on? Do we need to know a little bit more about the history, a little bit more about the meaning, and a little bit more about the participants that are involved in what is occurring? So the images that you see before you here relate to an occurrence that happened in October of 2014, where Corporal Cirillo was shot and killed while standing guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier in the War Memorial in Ottawa. The Canadian reaction to this event was for us to focus on Corporal Cirillo. So a lot of news stories came out talking about what a good father he was, how he loved animals, how proud he was of his reserve position with his unit, and how he really kind of relished in the fact that not only that he was Canadian, but that he was able to represent Canada in a military form. And so we have an individual being shot at a war memorial as we're coming closer to Remembrance Day, so very, very symbolically charged. And a lot of media outlets down in the United States were really kind of pushing for the Canadian news media to react as though this was a terrorist attack. And the Canadian media was very resistant to this. They did not want to glorify the shooter. They did not want to make the news stories about the event of the death of this person. They instead focused on him as a human being before this event happened. They focused on the people who stepped forward to offer him comfort while he was wounded. They stepped forward with news stories about the individual who eventually took down the shooter. And so we did everything to look to kind of the positives, the things that really reflected what it means to be Canadian. So in the one image where you have the smoking gun, and our reaction, instead of pulling out another gun and shooting back, is just to be kind of quiet and strong in a Canadian way. So you have the leaf emerging, and eventually the tree, meaning us as strong Canadians, will break apart this violence. We won't allow it to become a solid part of who we are and what our identity is. You also have in the other image, soldiers who are part of our social objective memory, reaching down and recognizing the sacrifice that this person has basically given of themselves to us as Canadians. So then there's this kind of brotherhood symbolically being represented, that they're saying, listen, we also sacrificed and we understand this sacrifice, and in a peaceful sort of manner, that this is how we are going to react to this event. And so you have on the right hand side of your screen here, you have the War Memorial that's smoking, and you have the Canadian Parliament buildings that are smoking. This came from the attempt with American news media to cause us to draw a parallel to the attacks that took place on 9/11. So 9/11, you have the Twin Towers coming down. I mean, you had other things that happened, but we always speak about the Twin Towers coming down. If you remember any imagery of this, there was a lot of flashing of kind of the smoking towers. And so what they're trying to do is say, listen, you guys have also suffered this attack. Same as what we did. You need to be on alert. It's a terrorist attack, and you need to react in this sort of way. And we said, no. Right, we're not going to do this. Instead, we're going to react in a more Canadian sort of way, focus on the victim of this and not the perpetrator. And we're not going to blow this into it being a terrorist attack. We're going to take it as being kind of more isolated, and we're going to be subdued in how we respond to that. Again, drawing from our own previous experiencing of violence. When I say our own, I'm talking about Canadian experiencing of violence and Canadian participation in violent actions. Now, are individuals violent? Should we look to individual motivations in terms of understanding violent actions, or should we look to something else? We know that through the Milgram electric shock experiments that were done in 1961 and the Stanford prison experiments that were done in 1977, that violence is less to be explained by the dispositions and motivations of individual agents, and that rather we need to be attentive to the factors of the situations in which people are placed. So we don't need to look to the motivations of individuals. Instead, what we need to do is to look to the factors of the situations in which people are placed. And this way, we can better understand that violence needs to be understood in terms of social and cultural factors, that it has little or nothing to do with individual motivations and has everything to do with culture and the situations that people are placed in. So with the Milgram experiment, you have individuals being put into the role of being what's referred to as the teacher. They thought that all individuals participating in this experiment were volunteers. Turns out that they were the only ones that were the volunteers. Everyone else was in on this experiment. So what you have is an individual sitting in the room with another person. In walks an authority figure, says to these two individuals, I want you to draw from the hat whether you're going to be the teacher or whether you're going to be the student. The volunteer, the only volunteer in there, reaches into the hat, and every time it's set up in such a way that they draw the teacher role. Now, what the teacher role was basically is they're sitting on the other side of this wall or this other side of this glass, so they can't see through to the other student or to the student. And the authority figure says to the teacher, I need you to ask a question of the student. Every time they get the question wrong, you are going to give them an electric shock. And with each wrong question, the intensity of that shock goes up. Now, the dials were labeled to where it said, harmful, dangerous, and then fatal. And so the person was well aware that every time they turned the intensity of that shock up, they were causing more damage, or they believed they were causing more damage to that person, up to them potentially killing them. And so the student starts answering questions. Again, the student is in on this, and the student does okay to start with, and then starts getting some questions wrong. The assumption is that most individuals would have free will and the ability to turn to the authority figure and say, I'm not going to do harm to this person, because they were free at any point to leave and free at any point to stop the experiment. And the result, though, was that approximately 72 to 73% of the individuals who participated in this continued through with the experiment to the point where it would have been fatal for the student had this been a real experiment that was being done. So again, that means that if the factors of the situations that people are placed in were such that 73% of us listening to this lecture could at some point, again, if the factors were just kind of aligned in the right or the wrong sort of way, could do harm to another individual up to the point where we could potentially kill them. And when we look at what happened in Rwanda, again, we will have this kind of example of this. It's not individual motivations that are causing people to act in this violent sort of way. It has everything to do with the factors of the situations in which people are placed. The Stanford prison experiments, again, you have another situation where they're trying to figure out where violence is coming from and why people behave in an aggressive manner towards another group of individuals. You have students at Stanford University being put into the role of either being the prisoner or being the guard. They were free to leave at any time, but they didn't leave, or none of them left. I believe it was 6 days into it, and it was shut down. So you have Zimbardo, the professor, the psychology professor, set this experiment up, and it ran from August 14th to the 20th in 1971. Now, the prisoners were stripped of their identity, meaning their clothing was removed. They were issued numbers, so they weren't referred to by their name anymore. And the guards were given uniforms and objects that would symbolize power, or that they were in a power or dominant position. It basically took them a few minutes to fall into their roles, meaning that even though, you know, these individuals knew each other, knew that they were students, and knew that this was just an kind of a fun experiment in a way, and that they could leave at any time or stop this at any time, they fell into these roles with such intensity that an outsider had to come in and say, listen, we need to shut this down. Zimbardo himself, the person who set it up, who was acting as kind of the prison warden, was so consumed by his own role that he wasn't able to identify the harm that was being done, not only to the prisoners, but the harm that was what was going to eventually happen to the guards when they were pulled out of that role and started to reflect on the things that they were doing to these other individuals, the kind of quote-unquote prisoners that they were encountering. So in order for you to get a little bit of an idea of what happened, I want you to pause and watch video number 3 and video number 4, and these should demonstrate to you that violence, again, is less to be explained by the dispositions and motivations of individuals, and that rather we need to be attentive to the factors of the situations in which people are placed. Again, we should understand that violence can best be understood in terms of social and cultural factors and not because of individual motivations. So please pause, watch video number 3 and video number 4. So at the start of the lecture, I mentioned to you that perspective plays a huge role in our interpretation of any violent act or the performance of violence. And there is what's referred to as being the triangle of violence. Most research that is done tends to focus on the victim rather than the perpetrator. It's an easier it's an easier set of eyes to look through, because we can sympathize with the victim, we can see the impact that it has had on them, and we can also understand the impact that it has had on our society as a whole as well. There's the fear, which I mentioned at the start of the lecture as well, that by trying to see through the eyes of the perpetrator, what we could be doing is condoning or validating this action. And so we rarely tend to want to look or try to look through the eyes of the perpetrator, but it's very important that we do this. And so the triangle of violence is not as clear-cut as it seems. It's not that easy to isolate someone as just simply being a victim. It's not easy to isolate someone as simply being a perpetrator, or just simply saying that a group of individuals are the observers. So a victim can be a perpetrator. A victim could have done things that resulted in the perpetrator at a certain point feeling as though they are justified in acting in a violent manner towards the victim. The observers can be perpetrators. This is the scenario where we have bullying taking place. And so you stand around as a group of individuals and you watch one individual attack another person, whether they're doing it verbally, whether they are doing it physically. At what point do you move from simply being observers and start to align yourself with the perpetrator role? Meaning that if you don't interfere, that if you don't stop, if you don't put yourself on the side with the victim and stand up against the perpetrator, then basically what you've done is you put yourself onto the side of the perpetrator. You said, listen, we're condoning this action, we are supporting this individual, and we're not going to interfere with what's happening. And a lot of individuals will tend to do nothing rather than something for fear that if they were to step into this situation, that they themselves would fall victim to the actions of the perpetrator. So when we're trying to assess a situation, we're trying to figure out from which perspective do I want to feel the impact of this? Do I want to be on the so-called winning side, the side that's not going to have violence used against it, or am I going to be on this other side over here? Most individuals will opt to do nothing or align themselves with being a perpetrator. In our society, we know that observers of violence can also be victims of violence. Children who witness violence in the home are understood to be victims of violent abuse. By witnessing violence, they don't even physically themselves need to have experienced it. That we said, listen, just seeing it can be enough for some individuals, and that we need to acknowledge that you can be a victim by seeing this act of violence as well. How is it that a perpetrator can be a victim? When we're talking about a perpetrator being a victim, I want you to think in terms of an occurrence that happened in 2007 in Iraq, and it was the Apache helicopter attack on a group of what the U.S. soldiers believed were insurgents or combatants. So to give you the very short story of this, U.S. troop or unit is in their Apache helicopter. They view individuals through their screen that they believe are acting in a suspicious manner. They seem to be carrying weapons on them, and they call back to headquarters and ask for authorization to fire on these insurgents or fire on these combatants. They get the go-ahead, yes, you can fire on them. They fire on the group of individuals and wipe them out. They find out that the group that they had shot, in that group were 2 news reporters. And what they thought were weapons was actually the cameras that these guys had slung across their chests. And the way that they were holding their cameras against their bodies as they were moving throughout this courtyard was in a way that was very similar to how a soldier would hold their gun against them if they had it slung across their chest as well. And so now these U.S. soldiers, well, they find this part out after, they're viewing this scene, and they see these individuals who at this point they're still assuming to be insurgents and combatants. This van pulls up and starts to give aid to these insurgents or these combatants. And so the unit in the Apache helicopter calls back to headquarters and says, listen, we've got this van here, and we need to get the go-ahead to take the van out because they don't know if it has explosives in it. They don't know if there are other insurgents in it, what's going on. So they get the go-ahead from headquarters. You can attack or shoot at the van. So they shoot at the van, they take out the van, and after they've done this, the ground units arrive. What the ground units find is that in the van was a family. Well, it was a father and 2 kids that were in the van. Now, I'm giving you the very short story. There's a lot of other kind of history events that led up to this, and then obviously that happened after the information about this attack were released to the media. But I'm giving you this example to demonstrate that how, even though someone could be a perpetrator of a violent act, they can fall into the role of the victim once they realize what it is that they have done. So for some of the soldiers who went through this, they have children at home. They had to acknowledge that we killed innocents. We thought, based upon all the information that we had available to us at that moment, that these guys were carrying guns, they were carrying cameras. We had no idea that there were children in the van, and we killed children. So while they are the perpetrator or the aggressor in the actual violent act itself, with the event of it and the results of it, they can switch from a perpetrator role into the victim role as well. So these examples that I'm giving to you guys should hopefully demonstrate that this triangle of violence, although seemingly clear-cut, is not. It's very muddied, it's very fluid, it's very dynamic. People are moving from being a victim to a perpetrator, from perpetrator to observer, observer to victim, etc. They're moving all around this triangle, and that again shows how unclear violence itself can be, and also the end results of violence can be. So is it easy to determine who is a victim of violence and who is the perpetrator? Could have answered this already and did answer this already. Absolutely no. It is very difficult to determine sometimes who is a victim of violence and who is the perpetrator, because there's a lot of gray area that can exist between these two roles. What do we use to kind of filter our determination of whether or not they were a victim or whether or not they were the perpetrator? Well, we look to things like status, gender, ethnicity, what religion this person was, political views that they held, the media. How is this being presented to us in the media? In the Apache helicopter attack that happened in 2007, I've put up an optional video for you guys, or I can put up an optional video for you guys to watch, that was released to the public, and it's referred to, or it's titled, Collateral Murder. And it was done in such a way to suggest to the public that the US soldiers were just gun-happy, crazy, violent aggressors who were, attacking victims and were just causing extreme amounts of damage. Now, of course, that can be the case, right? But when you step back from this video that was released called Collateral Murder, and you look at the events leading up to this encounter and the things that happened after that, you find out that there's a broader picture, or there's more to the story than what we were being told through this video clip. And I don't think any of us are surprised by that fact, that we've hopefully started to develop the ability to kind of question or challenge things when we're being told them in the media, that there's more to what's happening, and that I need to investigate this a little bit more, and I also need to try and see through the eyes of other individuals and not just through my own cultural lens. So we need to understand the side of the conflict that we are in fact on. Are you on the have side? Are you on the winning side? Or are you on the other side? I mean, bullying is very different if you are the victim of bullying or if you are the bully themselves. And so your justification of violence, if you are the bully, is going to be in place. You're going to think that you have every right, at least in this moment, to be treating this individual in the way that you are. If you are the victim of that, you're going to be thinking there is no justification for that individual's actions. It does not make sense to me. And so when we're trying to determine the positions or roles of individuals, whether they are the victim, whether they are the perpetrator, and also our interpretation of that act, we look to things like status, gender, ethnicity, religion, political views, media, and also what side of the conflict we are in fact on. Now, societies and ways that societies go about fostering a bias in favor of collective violence. One of the things that a society that is in favor of collective violence does is they reward violence. And so in a society that is in favor of collective violence, people will or can gain status from violence, either through goods attained during raids, through honor that they achieve, through acts that are considered to be brave, that involve violence, involve aggression. But basically what we have is a situation where members of a social group come to understand that there is a social and an individual benefit to be realized through violence and through aggression. We make violence a necessary way of protecting valuable resources. So there is a gendering, as I've already mentioned to you guys, that occurs with this bias towards collective violence. It stems from women and children being understood as though they are valuable resources within the social unit. Men are socialized and are basically told that in order to protect themselves and to protect their resources, they must act in a fierce and aggressive manner. We construct religious justifications for violence. If you can frame violence in terms of a struggle between good and evil, individuals are more apt to believe that there is a purpose behind the collective approach to that conflict. And not only is there a purpose, but there's kind of a morality behind it. And so if we're being told that there is this evil cultural group out there that wants to change our values, change our way of life, and that the reason that they want to change our values and our way of life is because their religion is different than our religion. If we are being told that, then we are more likely to find a justification for us acting in a collective manner to stop this group from coming at us. What we've basically done is we've located a struggle on a cosmic scale. And so we see this conflict being elevated beyond local concerns. And instead, we've started to invoke legendary battles between good and evil. And that once a cultural group starts to engage in this type of a dialogue, both sides of the conflict begin to voice their motivations in terms of religious justification. Examples of this can be seen from the current violent engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan, just to give you two examples. And so what we have is people often expressing their justification or their reasoning as to why we should be in Iraq and why we should be in Afghanistan in terms of us, the good, stopping this evil force from taking over the world. George Bush, after the 9/11 attack, said the United States represented the light, the beacon, and the hope of the world, and that the United States would not allow darkness, chaos, and evil to rule. What he was doing in his statement was again elevating this violent conflict beyond or above a local concern and making it a cosmic battle. And this really motivated individuals to step forward and say, listen, this doesn't have anything necessarily to do with me as a human living in Canada or the United States, but it has everything to do with the universe, where we have good fighting evil all the time. I see myself as being on the side of good, and so I'm going to engage in this. We need to, of course, acknowledge that on the other side of things, these individuals see themselves on the side of good and see the United States, Canada, whatever other country it is, as being on the side of evil. They are the invaders. They are the ones who are causing this chaos, bringing this darkness, challenging the lives of individuals. So again, both sides can at a certain point voice their concerns in terms of religious justification, and that obviously elevates it and motivates us to behave in a collectively violent manner. Now, are all societies violent? This was the question that I asked you guys to think about when we were talking about Thomas Hobbes and his belief that in the state of nature, one where we do not have essential political authority, that we would be in a constant state of war, man against man, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. So are all societies violent? No. Many societies actually go to great lengths to avoid their violence. So if Hobbes were correct, a society that was not violent should have very strong political authority regulating its behavior, correct? Right? Because that's what he was saying. Without regulation, without government, without a monarchy, it would just be sheer and utter chaos. And we are told this, right? If the government were to collapse at any point, Canadians would take to the streets and there would be looting and killing and whatever. So, fortunately we have the military, we have the police force to ensure our own safety. So again, in a society that's peaceful, we should see a strong military presence, strong police presence, and strong central political authority. What we find is that the least aggressive or least violent societies are actually ones that have a minimal amount of political authority or a minimal amount of central control. They are societies that are, for the most part, egalitarian. And egalitarian means that they view one another as being equal. And so characteristics of peaceful societies are that they emphasize sharing and cooperation. They go out of their way to condemn those who make claims that can be interpreted as a challenge to others. They will go out of their way to condemn or belittle individuals who mock people within their society, who try and stand on pedestals and say that they are better than everyone else. They will say, no, you're actually a lesser human, right? Because you're not cooperating with us, you're not sharing with us. And so you've isolated yourself, and that makes you weak and powerless. And we don't like that within our communities. Whereas in our society, we tend to champion people who are, aggressive or act in a kind of dominant sort of way. They sanction village monopolies of certain goods. So what they do, for example, is in an area where they want peaceful societies, they will say in Moose Jaw, you guys are going to grow corn. In Regina, you're only going to grow potatoes. And what that does is while Moose and Regina in theory could fight one another, should they wish to have access to either corn or potatoes, what they're going to find is that they need to develop an ability to cooperate and to share with one another. So in Moose, I'm eating corn, loving the corn, but I really want a potato. That means I'm going to have to establish a connection to someone in Regina, be nice to them, and get access to the potatoes, and they're going to have to do the same if they want access to the corn. So they actually sanction monopolies in villages of certain goods. They will have negative values that are attached to things that symbolize aggression. So if individuals within that society have a violent performance, a sporting event, or anything that seems to demonstrate that they're being rewarded for acting in an aggressive manner, that will actually be demeaned. It'll be devalued. They'll say this is not the appropriate way to behave. Instead, we need to cooperate. Characteristic of a peaceful society is one where they will minimize violence through ceremonies. They will bring people together. And they will say, listen, we have a shared history, we have shared language, we have a shared way of seeing things. We are the same people. And so they will use these ceremonies to bring people together, to emphasize the sharing and cooperation, rather than making them these kind of divisive things that causes one group to target or go against another group. What are the effects of war on societies? One of the biggest effects of war on society is political organization. So it has been suggested by some scholars that violent conflict was in fact the primary social force behind the transformation of human societies from small-scale autonomous villages into chiefdoms and then into states. So if we're talking about political organization, we need to look at Robert Carneiro and the evolution of the nation state, which is something that we will look at in the next lecture. But Robert Carneiro argues that war served to promote the consolidation of isolated politically autonomous villages into chiefdoms of united villages, and from there we moved into state formation. War, according to Robert Carneiro, began as an effort to oust a rival from a territory, but soon evolved into an effort to subjugate and control an enemy. As the process continued, warfare became the mechanism by which the number of political units in the world began to decline. Robert Carniero goes so far as to suggest and to predict that if the number of the political states continues to decline as it has been so far, by the year 2300, we should actually have a one world or a single world state. So what he's saying is that through war, smaller groups form larger groups form even larger groups, and they kind of take over one another, becoming these larger and larger entities. Right now, as things sit, there has been talk for years of a North American alliance. We have a European Union. We have people talking about excuse me, Asian alliance and etc. And so what they're basically saying is we want to have these smaller entities, these smaller nations come together into continents. And these continents will start to dominate kind of the political sphere. So Robert Carniero, I don't think, is incorrect in suggesting that if it continues at the rate that it has been, that by the year 2300, we could in fact have a one world state. So another effect of war on society is that violence can produce or increase solidarity. So if we're looking at violence producing or increase in solidarity, in particular, we find that male solidarity seems to be enhanced by collective violence. We know that if a group of individuals is threatened by an outside force, they will tend to come together in a very strong manner. So when the 9/11 attack happened, what occurred in Canada and in the United States is that people really started to identify with one another on the level of being Canadian, one another on the level of being American. It didn't matter ethnicity, gender, age, nothing in terms of those aspects of their identities were really at play. What it was, are you a Canadian? You know, these identities become at the forefront, and it really brought the nations together. A way that I can describe this to you guys is, let's say you and your brother fight all the time. You're constantly, at battle with one another, and you never hesitate to abuse them or get a couple digs in here or there. But one day, you and your brother are out on the front lawn, and the bully from 3 blocks down comes into your yard and starts attacking your brother, whether it's verbally or physically. Most individuals at that point will find a solidarity with their brother because this outsider has come to threaten aspects of their family or aspects of their community. So they will align themselves in solidarity with their brother and go after the bully, or at least prevent the bully from causing any harm. So we know violence can, of course, produce or increase solidarity within societies, especially when they're threatened with this kind of outside force on them. So what is ethnocide and what is genocide? Ethnocide is the attempt to destroy the culture of a people, and genocide is the attempt to exterminate a group of individuals. We know that during many violent conflicts, both ethnocide and genocide occur. We know that in the nation building in Canada, that ethnocide of groups of individuals did in fact occur, obviously primarily targeting First Nations groups, but that they experienced ethnocide, so the attempt by these other individuals to destroy the culture of a people. If ethnocide is not seeming to work as well or as efficiently as the dominant or the ruling party would want it to be, then genocide is something that they can also look to, which is to say, basically, if we can't change the culture of an individual and bring them in line with our type of thinking, then we will just eliminate the individuals themselves, which leads us to the larger question of whether or not nation building is nothing more than a genocidal or an ethnocidal institute. There are numerous academics who would claim, and again, this is something we will look at in the next lecture, but there are individuals who have claimed that just the very act of nation building itself relies upon ethnocide at the very least, genocide at the worst case scenario. So basically, in order for us to be a nation, we have to have an identity that is similar. We have to share worldviews. We have to share beliefs. And so multiculturalism doesn't work well with nation building. And so what people will do when they're the dominant power is try and have people kind of come in line with their beliefs, have them change their culture if their culture is seen to be in conflict with that of the ruling power. And so we have these academics, we have Pierre Vandenberg, Carol Nagengas, and George talking about nation states. Pierre Vandenberg says nation states are gangs who use violence to extract money from others, that they look to taxation, they look to control and dominate, and that they will wipe out groups of individuals in order to be successful. Carol Nagengas says that nation states use torture, rape, and homosexual assault to establish a punishable category of people. And this punishable category of people is in place because then you have this negative other that makes individuals within that society behave in a certain way. You see someone being tortured because of their belief or because of their actions, you are going to avoid acting like them. So you're more apt to kind of fall in line in terms of your behavior. And George talks about nation states forcing people to participate in public political and symbolic rituals, which can be done for fear of violence. That if you don't participate in this ritual, then violence will be used against you. So there are academics who suggest that nation state building is in fact nothing more than a genocidal or an ethnocidal institute. Now, we're going to talk about identity and violence, and the example that I'm going to give to you guys in terms of identity and violence is the occurrence that happened in Rwanda in 1994, where we had a very kind of violent conflict erupt. And when I say erupt, please know that I'm not saying it was kind of an isolated event that came out of nowhere. There was a history, there was a lot of forces at work that created this perfect sort of storm. But when we're talking about identities with individuals, we know that identities can in fact cause people to come together, or it can cause them to come into conflict with one another. Freud, looking at this narcissism of minor differences, actually spoke in terms of how when there is such a minimal difference between a group of individuals, they will actually fight with one another. We think that often conflict only occurs when there is vast differences between one group and another group. When you really look at these acts though, and then these performances of violence, you find that quite frequently it has to do with the fact that there is minimal or no difference between them. And if they're fighting for social or material resources, they need to come at war against this other person who would also potentially have access to this power, to this status, or to these social and material resources. And so Freud, in talking about the narcissism of minor differences, refers to the parable of freezing porcupines. There's this group of porcupines who are freezing, and they crowd together to profit from the warmth of one another, but soon felt each other's quills digging into them and had to separate. And so you can see it kind of illustrated as to how this narcissism of minor differences can in fact work, and also the power of identity, and how identity can of course be used for good, but it can also be used to create violence and conflict in an area where that violence and conflict did not exist previously. So we have in the area of Rwanda three kind of subgroups that together form the largest ethnic group in Africa, referred to as the Banyarwanda. So within this large ethnic group, there are Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. Hutu were 85% of the population, Tutsi 15%, and the Twa or 1%. All three groups spoke many languages, but did share a common language called Kinyarwanda or Kirundi, which was, if you're in Burundi, that would be the language that you would speak. But they share a common language. They're part of the same ethnic group. But when we think about Rwanda, we think of such distinct differences between these groups of individuals, and we tend to want to blame this difference as the reason as to why the violent occurrence in 1994 happened. So what led up to this? In terms of identity, the Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa were actually placed into three distinct races by colonial officials. And once placed into these distinct races, had the races themselves placed into a hierarchy where they did ranking. So the Tutsi were actually thought to be the most intelligent and capable group. The Hutu were thought to be in the middle of the pack. They were dull, but they were decent workers, so they could be tolerated. And the Twa were thought to have little or no redeeming qualities. According to Belgian colonial officials, the Tutsi were nothing of a Negro besides their color. They were tall, thin, had fine features. They had a high brow, thin nose, and fine lips framing beautiful shining teeth. The Hutu were short and thick-set with a big head. They had a jovial expression, a wide nose, and enormous lips. The Twa were a worn-out, disappearing race. They were small, muscular, very hairy, particularly on the chest. They had a monkey-like face, huge nose, and they were thought to be quite similar to the apes that they in fact chase in the forest. And they were thought to be gluttonous as well. So when the Belgian officials come into Rwanda and they're trying to find a way to control a large population of individuals, they start to look to the percentage. So again, we come back to this. The Hutu are 85%, the Tutsi are 15%, Twa are 1%. If you as a Belgian official are wanting to control the population there, which group would you elevate to a position of power? Now, I know many of you are going to think, well, of course, we're going to give the power to the Hutu, 85%, and so very easy to control the rest of the population. The problem that you would run into with that, though, is how do you, as a Belgian official, control 85% of the population? You could try it, be very difficult to do. Your best bet is to have the Tutsi in a position of power. And the Tutsi can then be the intermediaries that are going to control the Hutu and the Twa. And that is exactly what the Belgian officials did. They talk about the Tutsi as though they are capable of command, they're refined, courageous. They display a refinement of feelings, which is rare amongst primitive people, but they are natural-born leaders and capable of good judgment. And so the colonial officials say, listen, the Tutsi should be the ones in power. They're going to be the intermediaries between us and the people on the ground, and they're going to control the rest of the population. So the Tutsi realized power and privilege when the Belgian officials came in. They were sent to Catholic schools. They learned business. They were put into positions of government and positions of power in the region. And for many years, this was the way that things worked and seemed to kind of have its own logic. So we have, after World War I, the Belgians bringing in sweeping changes to Rwanda, and they figured this would, the best way to bring about economic production was to have efficiency in their administration. So they put the Tutsis in power. And so Hutus that had been in power found their power stripped away from them, and the Tutsis were given kind of the keys to the nation or the keys to the country. The Hutus began to be denied admission to Christian schools, which meant that they would be restricted in gaining access to economic and political domains. And so you have social material resources being denied to one group of individuals. So the Hutus, of course, are thinking we're 85% of the population. We are being denied kind of this privilege, power, and esteem that's been granted to the Tutsis by this outside force, and so we need to take it back. And so we have, in the 1950s, with independence starting to loom, the attitude of the church starts to change. And so the church steps in and says, maybe instead of the power only being granted to the Tutsis, we should see power being granted to the Hutu. Why did the church want to do this? I'm sure there was many factors. One of the biggest ones is them saying, listen, 85% of the population hasn't converted to our belief system, and if we give them power, or at least back them in their attempt to attain or achieve power, then we are going to get them as converts. And so it comes down to numbers again, where the church is saying, listen, 85% of the population isn't attending our churches. Let's give them that power. Let's back them. And so we see a shift happen where power is being stripped away from the Tutsis and given to the Hutu now. Now, the Tutsis aren't happy with this, of course. The Hutu are very happy with this. They think this should have been the way things were right from the start. And now this power shift creates this animosity, which was already in existence, but really kind of elevates it. So this is happening in the 1950s. And so you have attacks occurring back and forth, and I'm taking you through this very quickly, and obviously I apologize for that. We could spend a whole semester on it, but I'm trying to show you how this identity and these categories, which didn't exist before colonial powers put them in place, caused people to be denied access to resources, gave power to individuals for no reason other than this colonial official saying that they were Tutsi, saying that they were Hutu. They were from the same ethnic group, right? An outside force, though, said to them, you are different. And not only are you different, but we're going to give power to you. We're going to deny power to this group over here. And so this animosity and this conflict and this tension is building up from the 1950s. We have identity cards being given out in 1933, which individuals carried with them. And so you have an example of an identity card here where it identifies this female as being Tutsi. And the simple fact that it said Tutsi on there was enough reason for an individual to be justified in taking her life. So an identity card being forced upon them by an outside official, which makes them identify with a category that did not exist previously, results in justification for violence to the extent that that person would be killed. So what happens is in April to approximately July in 1994, after the shooting down of the president in the region, we find everything explode. And we have approximately 1 million Tutsi and moderate Hutu that are shot or hacked to death by their neighbors. So in 3 months, 1 million individuals, and that's kind of a lowball estimate, had their lives taken from them. Justification for these actions came about because of identity, because of this desire for power, because of this desire for social and material resources. Now we have a shift occurring here where the Hutu were seeing some of their power being taken away from them again in the early 1990s. And radio stations in Rwanda were telling Hutu families and Hutu listeners that the Tutsi were going to come back into the region because many had escaped and gone to surrounding areas, that the Tutsi were going to come back into Rwanda, and they were going to come back in the middle of the night and bring machetes and kill their families, rape their wives, and beat their children. And so the Hutu are very fearful. They're thinking that there's this whole group that's just waiting to take power away from them again. So it's not surprising that under this threat, they would turn against this group. The Hutu would turn against the Tutsi and feel justified. They're protecting their families, they're protecting their resources, they're acting in a manner that is aggressive, right? That's being valued in terms of them protecting these valuable resources. And so identity played a huge role in what happened there. And it wasn't an identity that was important to individuals on the ground until it was made to be important. And so we have an avalanche of words occurring, encouraging individuals to do their duty in order to protect their families and to protect their resources, to kill the Tutsi. It created this reality in Rwanda that was palpable. People believed this not only to be a threat, but basically to be looming. It was going to happen and that they had to stop it from happening. And in 3 months again, 1 million individuals lose their lives there. Now, we did have a Canadian response to what happened in Rwanda, with the United Nations going over under the leadership of Romeo Dallaire. So Romeo Dallaire is in Rwanda, and he is warning people at the United Nations in the months leading up to this, saying, listen, the area is going to explode. We need more feet on the ground. We need more troops on the ground. But the United Nations and other nations around the world that weren't participating in the United Nations, but people in positions of power were looking at what was happening in Rwanda, and they weren't wanting to call it genocide. What they referred to it is as tribal conflict, very racialized language. They said what was happening in Rwanda was tribal conflict. It was savage, it was brutal, it was man against man on a local level, very Hobbesian in the way they viewed this, and they did not think that it was of importance to people outside of Rwanda. So if they would have referred to as genocide, they would have had to have responded, but they didn't want to respond. They said, listen, these individuals have been fighting one another since the beginning of time. They're savage, they're primitive, and it doesn't really bother us. Never was it put in terms of a religious conflict or a cosmic battle. It was always thought to be local, nasty, dirty, brutish, and savage. Referring to it as a tribal conflict made people not want to involve themselves, and that unfortunately resulted in the loss of many, many lives. So Romeo Dallaire had stated to the United Nations, I just need, approximately 5,000 people. This is before April 4th, when everything exploded. I think it was April 4th. He said, I need 5,000 people here on the ground and we can stop this from happening. United Nations would not sanction that happening. They did not let the soldiers come over. Everything exploded. In the years since the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, they've run numerous studies and they've shown that he was absolutely correct. That if the world had responded with 5,000 soldiers, that they could have prevented this from happening. There still would have been loss of life because we would have seen pockets of violence breaking out, but that they would have been able to stop this absolute genocide from occurring. Unfortunately, the world did not want to involve itself because they thought identity was at play and that it was tribal conflict. Now, in terms of identity, we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, but always when we're talking about identity, what occurs is othering. So basically, you identify yourself as being a member of a group. How do you know you're the member of a group? Because you know you're not like that other, meaning someone outside of your group. And we as humans tend to want to align ourselves with the winning group or with the group that has the resources, with the group that has the status, the power, or whatever it is, that we are the ones who are achieving good things, and they are the ones that are seen to be achieving bad things, deviant individuals, etc. And so we have something that we can play around with in terms of othering. So we know that in some areas of the world, in Britain and in the United States, more so in Britain than what we're seeing in the United States, but you know, jokes that are being made in this kind of movement of quote unquote ginger hatred. And so people will say things like gingers don't have souls and gingers are freaks, and you know, gingers are lesser than human. And while it is amusing, and I say this again with quotes around it, to speak in these terms, it loses its humor if we were to change a word. So we have events that occur after a South Park episode airs where a Kick a Ginger site and a Kick a Ginger day was set, where individuals were encouraged to go to school or to go to their workplace and to kick gingers, because gingers have no soul, they're not human, so it can't obviously hurt them, and also it's a way for you to assert your power or your dominance over this other individual. And November 20th was the initial date that was set for Kick a Ginger Day. Unfortunately, kids went to school, people went to work, and their co-workers and their fellow students committed acts of violence against them. It seems absurd, it seems outrageous, but othering occurs all the time. And othering can, if it's not reined in, get to the point where people are willing to commit an act of violence against another individual because they believe them to be lesser than human, or because they believe they're going to achieve a degree of status by doing this. And so I'd like you just to pause, go to lecture video number 5, where you will get a brief little news story about what happened, and then we will continue on with the lecture. All right, so we're going to look at or address the readings that I wanted you guys to do, where we're talking about the human terrain team and the involvement of social scientists within the military realm, I guess is the best way to describe the military entity. So when we're talking about social sciences, the American Anthropological Association has set out this whole kind of scope of ethics. I don't expect you guys to memorize these. They won't be tested on the AAA Ethics. I just want you to be aware of them because they do influence people determining whether or not anthropologists should work in the military realm. And so the AAA Ethics: do no harm, be open and honest regarding your work, obtain consent, weigh competing ethical obligations, make your results accessible, protect and preserve your records, and maintain respectful and ethical relationships with those individuals whom you are researching or doing your research among. So we have a team down in the United States set up that is made up of anthropologists, psychologists, and geographers, was the main kind of group of individuals. And what the anthropologists were to do was to be these individuals on the ground that would get information about cultural norms, the appropriate way for soldiers to behave, what impact their actions would have. So the anthropologists, this is what the military was saying anyways, would hopefully allow U.S. soldiers to have a more positive engagement with people on the ground. So if they found out, for example, that in a village, if you go in, you should speak to the elders first, and that not to, if you don't speak to the elders first, it's a sign of disrespect. If you go into a village, you should not make eye contact with the females. You should speak to the males, and then, you know, if they give their approval, you can speak to the females, or whatever it was. The anthropologists were supposed to get this cultural information, put it into this nice package for U.S. soldiers to use, and then that would cause them to be able to be in a region and to not cause as much damage, or to have, again, a more positive interaction with the individuals on the ground. So out of the human terrain team comes these cultural awareness fact sheets, and it's this really thick book that was made with all this anthropological information. Now, the problem that the American Anthropological Association had with this information is that while it seemingly could be used for good, there was also the potential that this information could be used against the people on the ground there, and that it could be used for military or strategic purposes. An example of this would be finding out that Tuesday afternoons, all the males in the village have to attend a prayer service in a mosque or in a church. And so from a military strategic standpoint, if you want to go in and round up all the males in a village, what better day to do it than on Tuesday? You go there Tuesday afternoon, you surround one building, you've got them all. So there was this fear that this knowledge that again potentially could have positive usage could also be used against the people themselves. And so the human terrain team was called into question, and anthropologists in particular really went after any anthropologist who had joined the team, to the extent that if an anthropologist had joined the human terrain team, they would be blacklisted and they would not be able to get work outside of the military ever again. Now, this is obviously problematic because if you want people to be open about the work that they're doing and to challenge the authority, you need to say to them that you have this kind of backup plan that you can fall to if need be. If I'm working for the military and my association has said to me, listen, if you if you have chosen to do this work, you're never going to work outside of the military again, I'm going to be very hesitant to challenge the military and the usage of my results and their line of command and their line of reasoning, etc. I'm going to be very, very kind of inclined to work with them because that's the only work I'm ever going to have. Whereas if the AAA had said, listen, we don't really approve of it, but if that's the work you chose to do, then that's fine, we're going to allow you to do it. So it was problematic for a lot of individuals, and you can see from the readings that I had you guys do that a lot of the questioning that's coming out is, what resources are you using? Who's creating this information? Are you citing it proper? Are you acknowledging your position of power in this community? The anthropologists that were members of the human terrain team were trained as soldiers. It cost approximately $500,000 to train each anthropologist to go on the ground. Now, what you're seeing here with this individual sitting on the ground, you would not know that was an anthropologist. You would assume that that was just a soldier taking notes. And the AAA, the American Anthropological Association, said that's a problem. Right? If you're walking into a community or walking into a village dressed as a soldier with a gun, then that is how they're going to perceive you. They're not going to see you as being an academic. They're going to see you as potentially being a threat. And that is damaging to the knowledge, or calls into question the knowledge that you are getting from these informants or from these people. And not only that, should we be questioning the knowledge that was being generated, you're also putting future anthropologists at risk. Because if they start to associate anthropology with threat, then any anthropologist who goes into the field can find themselves in the position of potential harm, because they'll say, listen, we talked to someone before, that knowledge was used against us, and so we're just going to stop it right off the bat, and we're going to get you out of the community, or we're just not going to speak to you at all. So while there is a positive, obviously, to this knowledge that's being generated, there is also this underlying question at play. Who has control over the knowledge? Who is this knowledge being used against, or can it be used against? And who has access to it? So is it open knowledge, or is it something that only a small group of individuals can in fact utilize? All right, so I have a video here for you guys to watch. I want you to pause and watch that video, and then we will do some conclusions. All right, so there's obviously lots of points that can be concluded or can be summarized. Here are just a few of them for you guys to look at, kind of major themes. Violent conflict can be used to acquire status and possessions within a society. When that happens, people are more likely to behave in a collectively aggressive sort of way. There are peaceful societies. In peaceful societies, what we have is social strategies that are being used to prevent violent conflict from occurring or from escalating. Nation states use violence to promote the growth and centralization of state-level political structures and punish nonconformists. This is when we were talking about genocide and ethnocide and how multiculturalism can be problematic when we're looking at nation building or trying to secure an understanding of what a national identity is, and that people can use language to mask the realities of situations. So people use language and people use interpretations of things in order to distance themselves from the very real consequences of the violent performances that they are using. All right, so that takes us to the close of this lecture.